Imagine a country that looks like a paradise in every tourism brochure you have ever seen. A place with crystal-clear lakes, snow-covered mountains, clean cities, low crime, free healthcare, world-class education, strong democratic institutions, and a reputation for being one of the safest and most peaceful nations on earth. And now imagine that this same country is quietly being abandoned by its own people, not because of war, not because of dictatorship, not because of famine or collapse, but because of something far more uncomfortable, because the economic reality no longer matches the promise. And today, that country is New Zealand. This is not a story about a failing state. This is a story about a successful country developing a structural weakness so deep that it is pushing away its youngest, smartest, and most productive citizens. And this is why the story of New Zealand matters far beyond its borders, because it reveals how even rich, developed economies can start bleeding talent without anyone noticing until it is too late. New Zealand is home to just over 5.3 million people, making it one of the smallest populations among advanced economies, and its extreme geographic isolation places it literally at the edge of the global economic system, far from major consumer markets, shipping routes, manufacturing hubs, and financial centers, which creates a very unique set of incentives and constraints that shape everything about its economy. On the surface, life in New Zealand appears excellent, with high living standards, strong social cohesion, relatively low inequality compared to other countries, and a culture that values fairness and stability. But beneath this surface lies a structural economic reality that has slowly been pushing people away. Over the past several decades, New Zealand has developed one of the highest emigration rates in the developed world on a per capita basis, and the most striking detail is not just that people are leaving, but where they are going. Because the overwhelming majority are moving to Australia, with nearly 10% of all New Zealand-born citizens now living there, a level of population loss usually associated with developing countries or regions facing severe economic stress. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question. How does a country that seems to be doing almost everything right still fail to keep its own people? The answer begins with the fundamental structure of the New Zealand economy, which is defined first and foremost by its size and isolation. A small population limits the size of domestic markets, which in turn limits how large industries can grow, how specialized labor markets can become, and how many high-paying, high-skill roles can exist within the country. Unlike large economies that can sustain entire ecosystems of specialized firms, suppliers, researchers, and skilled workers, New Zealand simply does not have the scale to support many globally competitive industries beyond those that are absolutely tied to its geography. Manufacturing struggles because anything produced in New Zealand can usually be produced more cheaply and at larger scale in Asia, closer to supply chains and shipping routes. Advanced services face similar challenges because global firms prefer to operate from financial and commercial hubs that are deeply integrated into the international system. And while Auckland is a well-run city, it cannot compete with Singapore, Hong Kong, London, or even Sydney in terms of global connectivity, liquidity, and institutional depth. This means that the industries that thrive in New Zealand are primarily those that must be there, such as local services, tourism, agriculture, and housing-related activities, which creates an economy that is stable but narrow productive in certain areas, but limited in opportunity for ambitious professionals seeking growth. Agriculture is often cited as one of New Zealand's greatest strengths, and rightly so, because the country is one of the most agriculturally productive nations in the world, benefiting from fertile land, abundant water, favorable climate, and advanced farming technology that allow it to export high-value food products to densely populated markets in Asia. But modern agriculture does not create large numbers of jobs, especially not for university-educated urban young people, because farms are highly mechanized, capital-intensive, and optimized for efficiency rather than employment. As land values rise, farmers invest even more in machinery to maximize output, further reducing the need for labor, which means that while agriculture generates wealth, it does not absorb the growing educated workforce that the country itself produces. This pushes much of the economic focus toward urban areas, where the dominant activity becomes housing. And this is where New Zealand's most serious structural problem emerges. Over time, housing has become the single most important economic driver in the country, with buying, selling, renting, building, financing, and regulating property, collectively accounting for an enormous share of economic activity, to the point where a significant portion of national wealth is tied not to innovation or productivity growth, but to rising land values. When an economy becomes heavily dependent on housing, the incentives shift away from productive investment and toward speculation, scarcity, and rent-seeking. And the consequences are predictable: rapidly rising prices, declining affordability, and a growing divide between those who own property and those who do not. The irony is striking, because New Zealand is sparsely populated, yet its housing is among the least affordable in the developed world. Driven by zoning restrictions, limited urban density, strong demand, and a cultural and financial system that treats property as the safest and most attractive investment. Government attempts to cool the market, such as restricting foreign buyers, had limited effect because foreign buyers made up only a small share of total demand, and the largest group of foreign investors, Australians, were exempt due to long-standing free movement agreements. Wealthy Australians, attracted by natural beauty, political stability, and favourable tax treatment, continue to invest heavily in New Zealand property, particularly in desirable locations like Auckland and Queenstown, further pushing prices beyond the reach of local young people. At this point, a natural question arises. If housing is expensive in New Zealand, why do people move to Australia, where housing in cities like Sydney and Melbourne is also notoriously expensive? The answer lies not in housing costs alone, but in opportunity. Australia's much larger economy supports a far wider range of industries, firms, and career paths, creating deeper labour markets, higher average wages, and more opportunities for specialisation and advancement. For professionals in fields such as medicine, engineering, finance, technology, research, and management, Australia offers more roles, larger organisations, higher pay ceilings, and better long-term career prospects. Normally, this kind of migration from smaller towns to larger cities happens within a country, but in New Zealand's case, the nearest large cities are in another country, and the barriers to moving there are remarkably low. The relationship between Australia and New Zealand is unusually close, resembling the freedom of movement seen within the European Union, allowing citizens of both countries to live, work, and study across borders with minimal restrictions. Language, culture, and social norms are almost identical, reducing the psychological cost of migration. And New Zealanders in Australia face far less social friction than migrants from more distant countries, making the decision to leave even easier. Education plays a major role in reinforcing this pattern, because Australia has a larger and more diverse higher education system, with more universities, more seats in competitive programs, and policies that often treat New Zealand students similarly to domestic students in terms of tuition and financial support, particularly in high-demand fields like medicine and engineering. Many young New Zealanders move to Australia for education, build professional networks there, and never return, accelerating the outflow of talent. The result is a classic brain drain, but one that is unusually severe for a high-income country, with nearly 600,000 New Zealand-born people now living in Australia, compared to fewer than 100,000 Australians living in New Zealand, many of whom are retirees rather than working-age professionals. This creates a demographic imbalance, where young, productive workers leave while the domestic population ages, increasing pressure on public services and reducing the tax base needed to support them. To compensate, New Zealand relies heavily on immigration, bringing in workers from Asia and other regions to fill labour shortages. But this creates a secondary dynamic where some immigrants view New Zealand not as a final destination, but as a stepping stone to Australia, using its relatively accessible migration system to gain citizenship before moving on. Over time, this risks turning New Zealand into a transit economy, one that trains and houses people temporarily before they leave for better opportunities elsewhere. None of this means that New Zealand is on the verge of collapse, because it remains a stable, well-governed country with low public debt, strong institutions, and a high quality of life that continues to attract retirees, investors, and wealthy individuals seeking safety and stability. And these intangible factors have real economic value, allowing the country to sell premium property, golden visas, and lifestyle advantages to those who can afford them. However, Stability alone is not enough to retain young talent because ambitious people prioritize opportunity growth and the ability to build a future. And when those opportunities are more abundant, just across the ocean and moving there is easy, people will leave. The deeper lesson of New Zealand's experience is that modern economies must compete not only on safety and livability, but on ambition, productivity, and opportunity. Because in a globalized world, talent is mobile, and even the most beautiful and peaceful countries can slowly hollow themselves out if their economic structures fail to evolve.